The ICF Training and Technical Assistance Team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing Community Development training session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting, and Staffing Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. Today's training session is part of our racial equity training series and is entitled The Personal Journey, Understanding Racial Identity. It is my privilege to hand the presentation to our first presenter today, Kavita. Kavita, please take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome, everybody. It's good to be with you all today. My name is Kavita Singh Gilchrist, and I'm one of the co-founders of Racial Equity Partners. And we are one of the partners to Chris and team bringing this training series to you. I know you have a whole body of amazing trainings, and so we're excited and happy to have you join this one today. Racial Equity Partners works across the country with a lot of different organizations across a number of sectors, but the majority of our clients are in the housing and ending homelessness space. So we're really excited to see you today. My personal background was largely in the education space, where I started my racial equity journey and work, and really deeply working deeply on issues related to this ending the school to prison pipeline. So I'm sure many of you know about schools and education and very, very similar disparities, particularly with our young Black and Brown students, Indigenous students, really deep disparities that started at such a young age. But I was very excited to then partner with Donald and Jeff Olivet and start a new organization where we're really combining the best practices and promising practices that we're learning from across different sectors into just kind of what organizations need to do internally around human resources and inclusion at the staffing level. And then, of course, into the good work that you bring into this world and how we can create more equitable and inclusive programs and practices across all of the work that we do. And I'm here today with one of my colleagues. I'm going to pass it to Sarah to introduce herself.
Thanks, Kavita, and hi, everybody. Nice to be with you all today. I'm Sarah Breyer, and I'm an associate with Racial Equity Partners. Also run my own consulting practice that centers race equity in policy development and organizational development. And I come to the work with about 30 plus years of experience doing justice transformation work. So working in our justice systems to try to make them fair and equitable. So there's a whole, I could talk about that for a long time, but I won't. And led my own organization through racial equity transformation. And most recently was a Kellogg Fellow, Racial Healing Kellogg Fellow. So excited to bring my background and my passion to work with Kavita at Racial Equity Partners and to be in the room with all of you today.
Thank you, Sarah. So a little overview of what we're going to go over today. This is the third session in what we do as a series. If you joined a couple of weeks back, we did a session, actually it was Sarah and Donald, I believe, on the historical analysis and really focusing on structural racism. Then last week, we did one on institutional transformation and looking at workplace issues. And today, we are working on a more personal journey. And today's session is about developing an understanding of race, learning more about whiteness from supremacy to privilege, and really kind of unpacking what these terms mean, how they show up, and discuss our challenges and ways that we avoid the topic of race and whiteness and these words that have continued to be challenging, even for those of us who may have been using them for some time now. It always depends on what context you're sitting in, right? Whether you're with family members or workplace or new community members, it can be challenging every time you come to the table to talk about these things. And yet we need to continue that work. So we're going to have three sections. The first is to talk about race and racism and unpack that a little bit. The next one is, again, around us understanding whiteness and go a little deeper on that. And then the third is this section we call spotting detours. these kind of common ways that we avoid the conversations and how we can try to work against those things. Just by recognizing them in ourselves, it can go a long way. As I was talking about the other sessions that we do, we frame our sessions around the 3 levels of racism, always remembering that we really have to work at each of these levels and the ways it shows up structurally, systemically, in policies and the ways that things are governed. And then institutionally in our organizations, we talked a bit about that last week, lots to unpack there, both in our personal interactions when we come to work and implicit bias and microaggressions, as well as actual ways in human resources, recruitment, onboarding, hiring, the ways that we can work against and create more equitable systems institutionally. And then today we're focusing on the personal journey. As individuals, we're focusing here and understanding race and our own racial identity and how it shows up in the work that we do. We'd like to start this session with this quote. Some of you may know this writer, Ta-Nehisi Coates, has done some amazing work over the last decade and probably before that. But this is a book that he wrote, Between the World and Me, and it was really a piece dedicated to his son and talking about the experience of, growing up as a Black man in America. This quote really kind of gets at the heart of these words of race and racism. And he says, Americans believe in the reality of race as this defined feature of the natural world. Racism is the need to ascribe kind of bone deep features to people and then humiliate, reduce, and destroy them. And that inevitably follows from this inalterable condition. In this way, racism is rendered as the innocent daughter of Mother Nature. And one is left to deplore the middle passage or the trail of tears the way one deplores an earthquake or a tornado, as if it was so natural, or any other phenomena that could be cast as beyond the handiwork of men, as if it was beyond the handiwork of men. But race is the child of racism, not the father. And there's a lot in there, and a lot. I highly recommend both this book as well as this quote as a way to kind of enter this conversation around race and racism, and really understand that if it wasn't for racism, race would not have been invented. And that's essentially what Coates is describing here. But we have been trained in a very different way, so it's going to take a lot of untraining, retraining to understand just kind of the sequence of events as to what brought us to where we are today. And then the last thing we'd like to go over is, as we have these conversations around race and racism, some guidelines for our discussion. There is a little image here, Courageous Conversations About Race. A man by the name of Glenn Singleton. He wrote this book and curriculum around courageous conversations around race in the early 90s, actually in the education space. And many people have gone on to use this book as a way of working within your teams. It gives you all kinds of exercises and ways of entering the conversation. And in that book, he lays out actually in great detail these guidelines around discussion. So the first is to expect to experience discomfort. Uncomfortable conversations, words we haven't used before. We can say Black so easily and maybe white less easily, right? These terms, if you haven't been having these conversations, can feel uncomfortable when you say words, when you use language, and then of course then when you share your feelings about something. So it can be uncomfortable, and so expect to experience that discomfort. And we just hope that you can work through it, and we guarantee if you can get on through to the other end, you'll be building a muscle, building the muscle to have these conversations and just continue to just be stronger every time you come to the table. Stay engaged. that one's easier said than done. It is very easy to retreat from conversations when you feel uncomfortable or when you don't like what someone said, or and maybe rightly so, you need to leave the table if someone has perhaps said something so offensive that you just don't really want to engage. We encourage you to take breaks if necessary. If something like that happens, of course you should walk away. But if you can perhaps maybe find some language to question the person on the other side, we hope that you can stay engaged in as much as possible. Speak your truth. Often particularly when uncomfortable moments happen, maybe when someone does say something that feels off in some way, another person might want to step in and say, that's not what Jen meant to say. Jen, I'm calling on you because you're on camera, thank you. That's not what Jen meant to say. She actually, and then you go on to explain. We don't need that from each other, right? We're not here to explain or represent a group or any of that. Speak your own truth. It's only by asking questions and having those difficult conversations that we can kind of work through to the other end. Expect and accept non-closure. This is tough, especially for most people. Like, you want to have a conversation and you want to feel good at the other end of it, right? You want to feel like we've all come to a better understanding, maybe the same understanding. And that's just not how these conversations always go. Sometimes they do. And that's great when that happens. And often they don't. Often we may leave with different understanding, with, feeling like realizing I wasn't as, woke as I thought I was, whatever it might be. You have to kind of accept that things don't always get wrapped up in a good bow and some good closure. And then the last is to suspend judgment. This is not part of Glenn Singleton's 4 guidelines for discussions, but this is something one of our other amazing REP associates came up with, is to really, this is the one that makes the other ones kind of, it helps you stay engaged by suspending judgment, right? Assume good intentions. That doesn't mean that everyone always has them, but you try to start there in as much as you're able, and you'll know when the intentions aren't good. You'll have a little more conversation. You'll get to the other end, and you'll see where you can go. So those are the guidelines, and we hope that they're helpful in as much as they can help you stay engaged in the conversation. Okay, so we're going to start this first section actually with a video. I'm going to stop my share here. We use a series in this personal journey. These are called Conversations on Race. They were done by the New York Times in 2005. And each of them is, it's like a 5 to 6 minute video. It's conversations on race with Latinos, conversations on race with Black women, different identity groups. And the first one we're going to watch today, and then we can have a discussion, is a conversation with Latinos on race.
I think the Latino identity is pretty confusing to me because oftentimes I find it in a little checkbox on a form, and I'm confused on whether I should put Latino or Hispanic, but I'm Mexican.
As Latin Americans, as Hispanics in the US, there's a community that gets built regardless of which specific country you're coming from.
In our history is a history of African people, indigenous people, Europeans, conquistadores, all these different people colliding, many times not with their consent. So that informs all these loaded issues people have.
It's like navigating 3 identities. If you're from the States, you're American, you're Black, and you're Latina. And furthermore, wherever country that you identify in coming from. And that's a lot to navigate.
But at this point in my life, I actually don't identify as Guatemalan, and it's something that I guess a lot of like young immigrants sort of feel, where there's this saying like, ni de aquí, ni de allá, not from there, not from here.
In trying to blend in with the culture in America, I gave up a lot of what I grew up with. Maybe I saw it as something that was kind of shameful or in the way. I wanted to dress like my friends in America. I wanted to talk like them. I wanted to be like them, listen to the same music. I started listening to country music.
I got all these crazy questions like, did you come here in a canoe? And do you know what snow is? And do you live in a hut in Puerto Rico?
I thought my name was Spick until I was about 13. And that was my first awareness that race was an issue.
People say, oh, you look like a white dude. In some context, not in all contexts, depends where I am, depends who I'm with, depends whole lot of things. Depends what language I'm speaking. But however I look, when I leave my name, I can't get a phone call back about an apartment in New York City. And this isn't like 10 places I call, this is like 30.
And I remember telling a kid one time, I was like, let me tell you, the Ku Klux Klan comes here and they see your last name, you're going too, bro. You know? And the kids are like, what are you talking about? And it was like a big thing.
People generally, you know, unless I speak Spanish, you know, people assume right away, I mean, that I'm African American, that I'm black. You know, I mean, it's, you know, just one of those things. It may be the deep voice, it may be the color of my skin.
Because I talk white, I'm not Dominican, or I'm not black, or I'm not Afro-Latina, or whoever people perceive me as of being. And that hurt, and that still hurts.
Because one of my daughters is lighter than the other, they had blackness issues. And I remember my oldest daughter telling my youngest daughter that she was black and that her hair, she said something, and I remember crying like immediately, like, oh my God, no. And I had to sit them down and talk to them about our roots and that everything that they learned from the family was wrong.
I feel like I wanted more of my culture. You know, I grew up, there was a point I stopped speaking Spanish to her, and I still don't speak to her in Spanish. So I feel like something was lost, and I don't know if it was just because she was busy raising 5 kids and didn't really think about culture in that way and how I would come to identify myself.
Growing up, you know, like this, as you know, as a young teenager, I told people I was Puerto Rican, which is completely, you know, which is right. But at a particular point when I became a little more politicized, I was definitely more of a black nationalist than I was a Puerto Rican nationalist. Maybe because the concept of black nationalism and the black liberation movement is so much more accessible. There isn't a language issue. So yeah, I totally was reading Malcolm and Marcus and James Baldwin and Huey Newton before I read any of the Puerto Rican nationalists.
Either you're black or you're white, and if you're like kind of in the middle, you kind of like don't want to be in the middle. You want to, a lot of us want to be white, but we're still brown. We're still color, you know, we still have color, you know, we're still, according to what the institution is telling us, what race is based on your skin color. So you're like, I'm brown. So that's kind of like where it came. Like, I'm not black. And I'm not white, and I don't want to be white. So I'm kind of brown, and this is kind of like a thing that's there.
If you are closer to being white, you are supreme. If you are not, you are less than. And to me, that's how I've understood it, and that's why I think it's very important that Latinos who look like me say, you identify as Latino, cool, Colombiano, cool, whatever else, but you benefit from light skin privilege. The fact that you have ojos claros, people want to fetishize that, understand what that means. However much I might want to say, oh my gosh, I'm so special because I have green eyes, you're perpetuating white supremacy by running with that.
I'll talk to a young girl, a young teenager, and she'll say, you know, I'm not white enough to fit into mainstream society. I'm not Black American enough to fit in that, in that faction of society. And I'm like, but you know what? You're the best person to be kind of like a connector between both, because in you is everything. And being Latino in an American kind of New World way is basically being a physical embodiment of how America began as we know it. So you're every woman. So for me, being Latino is being phenomenal.
Thank you, Kristen. I forgot to, I apologize, I forgot to say before we show those videos that they're incredible videos, and they can also be pretty painful to watch. So I apologize for not giving you a bit of a heads up there if that's the first time you're seeing them. And I just thank that last woman because she really ends it on probably as positive of a note as we can, knowing how much work needs to be done when we are so exclusive of people based on things that cannot be controlled. So we're going to go over a few slides to just really dig into the nonsense related to race. That's essentially going to be our new title, Sarah, the next time we talk about it. So race and racism, and just really surface all of the craziness around what it has, the language that's been put out into this world, and how we have to continue to figure out how to work differently. So race is a social construct. And so, you've probably heard that before. And what that means is that it has been constructed, made up, really to support the social stratification of folks and the oppression of people. And so, number one, race has no genetic basis. Not one characteristic, no trait, no gene that we have actually distinguishes members of one so-called race from other members of this other so-called race. That's just, if you've ever read anything like that, it's not true. It's just, you have to debunk it. It's not true. Humans, unlike many animals that live among us, they simply haven't even been around long enough or isolated long enough to even evolve into separate subspecies or races. It's just not true. And so despite these different appearances that we have on the surface, we are one of the most genetically similar of all species. So there's just, I imagine I haven't gone deep on books on that. I've read and watched many movies. I think there's probably books that really can go deeply onto to debunk some of the studies and things that have gone to try to prove otherwise. And actually, most variation is actually within different groups and not between. So while people may think Black folks and Latino folks and these already, as I'm saying it, these categories that don't make sense because those are actually different things that they're being typed around. Again, most variation is within different groups. So for example, and this is information from a group called California Real, REEL, as opposed to this initiative. So like of the small amount of total human variation, 85% actually exists within a local population. So whether it's Italians or Koreans or Cherokees, 95% can be found within a continent. That means that two random folks who are both Korean may be as genetically different as a Korean is to an Italian. That's how kind of crazy all this thing around race is, that it's just not that simple. It's just not that simple, and kind of speaks to why there's so much confusion within race and kind of ethnicity and national origin. So the other points we wanted to just make is that, of course, in America, the US was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. But our early economy was, of course, based largely on slavery. And the only way that they could rationalize that was with this new idea of race. And it helped explain why some people could be denied rights and freedoms that other people were taking for granted. That was absolutely used and evolved with freedom in this country. And it just justified social inequality and the oppression we know through slavery, the elimination of the Native folks when we arrived. All of this, these racial categorizations were used as proxies to eliminate groups for labor and for land. There's so much more there, of course, really kind of ugly history for us. The other thing I wanted to show you and we wanted to share with you was just how it's developed on our US Census. And since we just recently completed one, what was it? I guess 2020, we just did one. We wanted to take you through what used to be on there to where it is today. So way back in 1790 was, I think, the first census, and there were 2 racial categories on the census: free or slave. That's what it said. So that's where it started. Then between 1790 and 1950, they actually had census takers. I think we still have them. I haven't seen one myself recently, but they used to be the way, right? And they would send people out to take the census. And those folks determined what race you were. I'm pretty sure they probably weren't asking people. So there were specific rules about who was going to be counted white. I don't have those, but that's how it was done. And then up to 1930, you have, we cited what was written for guidance, and it said a person who was both black and white should be counted as black, no matter how small the percentage of Negro blood, right? That was written, codified. And then juxtaposed to that, people who were white Indian should be counted as Indian, except where the percentage of Indian blood is very small. It just the ridiculous contradictions, right, in how folks were typed, and particularly the Black experience and the Indigenous experience, and how different, right? You need a drop, you don't want a drop, right? Just really hard to read and know that this is
just what is it?
And then in 1990, if a person marked more than one race category, the Bureau would recategorize the person to a single race. So that's going on behind the scenes. Not sure how they picked. And then around that time, people were first asked if they were Spanish/Hispanic origin. And we all know how complicated that one is. Collapsing so many different countries into one "are you or aren't you" question. Then in 2010, people were able to identify more than one race category, and then up to 2015. This is a factoid of the 42 million adults in the U.S. with Hispanic ancestry. About 5 million said that they do identify as Hispanic or Latino. That was in 2015. So, just some information to show how, if you think it's confusing for what we have to do as staff, and then for the good people that you're helping to house, it is because it was designed that way. That we don't have a solution, right? It's so confusing now because now it's a mix of color, it's a mix of ethnicity, it's a mix of national origin. So it's still very confusing, and we're going to have to figure out our way out of that at some point.
When I do screenings at my work,
Yeah.
they ask race and ethnicity.
Mhm.
And if folks are Mexican, they have us check white, which is so strange. I create my own space for folks.
Yeah.
But that is just strange to me.
Yes. And if it feels strange, it is strange, because look at the nonsense that this is like 200 years of that. And we know it got slightly better with this last census, but that's because they asked 3 different questions, I think. I think they actually asked a national origin question. But if race still continues to be on there and it's confusing, complicated. Mm-hmm. As a matter of course, though, Samantha, you're doing exactly what you should, which is you should create, there are some promising, I won't say best because there's no best yet, but there's promising practices on, even if you only have to report one Asian category, you can still ask your staff, you can break it down into the many countries that make up the Asian category, so that you're being inclusive with your staff and showing East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian, the different countries, physically different countries, and then wrap it up for comparison into the Asian category if you have to do a comparison, So it sounds like you're doing something like that. So we're going to end with one more video, and then go over a couple of key points, and then put you into breakout rooms with a question. So now we're going to look at another conversation, and this is Conversation with Black Women on Race.
As a Black woman who was a Black girl, I see the attack on us comes in a very different form. In some ways, it comes in the same form. You know, people do experience racial profiling and police brutality, but sometimes you come across women who have not had that direct interaction. But we're attacked in so many nuanced ways.
So you have internal race issues within our own culture, and then the external race issue, and then your mothering issue around race. So for me, race and being a woman of color is so multi-layered. It's like you can excavate all day.
2 uniformed security guards walked over to us, one white, one Latino, and began to ask us questions about what we were doing in the lobby of that hotel, if we were a guest. Quickly responded and said that I was in fact a guest. I was asked details, my name, what room, and it was at this point that I became very upset.
And then you start to wonder, well, what other difference could it be if you're a white cop, I'm a Black female? What other difference, what else could I have done to piss you off this much? It just starts to then look racial.
We actually had to bring in a white colleague from the Justice Conference before anyone could get an official response from the hotel.
I've had people focus on my hair not being professional enough. I had an executive director actually pull me into a room, and it went down a path of like, you know, just letting you know, like, I don't think that you're professional enough. And I kind of had to go through this whole, I had to actually pull back because I felt like I couldn't be emotional.
All the other chorus girls were white. And I remember going up to the person in charge of costuming and saying, you know, why is it that we're dressed this way? Why is our hair doing this weird, just lumped together thing, and all the other girls get to do curls and pretty things? And she was like, yeah, but your hair can't do that. And I was like, you never asked me. But for me, it was really hard because I just wanted to dance and sing and be in the play. And I was being told, like, you're not good enough, your hair isn't good enough, your clothes aren't good enough. And we're gonna make sure everybody notices that you're Black and everybody else isn't.
And that colored my own thinking about myself. And I was like, maybe I am unattractive. Maybe I am like this monster. But then I'd call my mom and she'd be like, don't listen to them. Obviously, I gave birth to you and I'm gorgeous. So obviously you have to be gorgeous. So I always whenever I always felt bad, I'd always think about that.
There was a huge population of Black girls who weren't dating anyone. And I wondered why that was, because in my eyes, they seemed to be beautiful and attractive and smart and intelligent and ambitious. And it just didn't make any sense to me why they didn't have a boyfriend too. And that same consciousness is also what I'm thinking now at almost 25 years old, like why that's the world that I still see today.
Once you accept your womanness, that's where your power comes from. It doesn't necessarily always come from your academic prowess. It doesn't always come from what you have. It comes from your perception of self. And when you accept that you're a woman and I'm a woman, hear me roar, that comes from a validation outside of yourself. And even if you want to say it doesn't, it does.
My father would buy me books. And before he would give me the books, he would painstakingly shade in the characters in the books in brown crayon. I still have some of these books. I mean, I had like Cinderella, she was brown, like all these things. And of course, as an older toddler, you notice that they've been drawn in because he's not an artist. And he would explain, you know, as much as he could to a 5 or 6 year old why he was shading in these characters to look like me.
I don't have a daughter right now, but if I did have a daughter, I would tell her that she's beautiful, that she's intelligent, that she's all of these things all the time, because I feel like we don't hear that enough in the media. We don't get that attention.
What I would tell my daughter is not what was ever told me, and not something that I really thought I would ever say. But ultimately, to my girls, I want you to be happy. I want you to find joy in however you define it. Not what I want out of you, not what society imagines of you, not anyone's fantasies of you. Your happiness and your joy, and I have your back.
Thank you again, Kristen, for sharing that video. Another painful with moments of joy and how people work through such painful experiences. Before we send you into breakouts, the key points around this section, race is a social construct. It's made up, and here's where we are. You can see the mess that we've created as a result of the construction of this term and these divisions. And you know, actually one of the detours people like to do is, well, if it's made up, then why are we talking about it? It's like, well, unfortunately, the impact of racism is real, and we created a hot mess, and we have to figure out how to work our way out of it, but that's not going to be done for a very long time. So grappling with these issues around racial categorization is frankly probably one of the more easier things. It's the impact of racism and the stories that the women and the men in these videos are sharing, that your own colleagues are having, that you may be having, right? That impact is very real and continues to this day. And knowing others' experiences is really important to just, particularly if you may not encounter those as often. Of course, our racial identity shapes who we are, how we experience the world. People carry things all the time that you may not see, know, or understand. And so the more we can really appreciate people's experiences, the more we can have a better understanding. And of course, use our racial identity as a place of strength to create change. So we want to go into small groups now for about 15 minutes. And here's the discussion questions. What would be really great if you go into your small groups, if you're able to turn your cameras on, that would be wonderful. These are some really personal discussions, and it's always nice to see people's faces when you're talking to them, if you're able. These are the questions we want you to discuss. First question is, when someone asks you where you're from or what your background is, what do you say? Just share that. And the second question is, if you can get to it, you know, it'd be great to get around the room and just answer the first question. And if you can answer the second one, great. The second is, how does your own ethnic identity shape how you come to these conversations about race and racism at work? Yeah, Guyana's a perfect example of that. The combination of I mean, I went to school here in America, so my geography is horrible because I remember it being in college, Samantha, and we lived with a gentleman. He was from Spain. He was our roommate, and we had a map someone had given us, and we had it up for years. I hadn't thought about it, and he was the first one to clue me in that the United States and the North American continent was smack in the middle, and we split Asia. Have you seen? Many people have this map. It's like we split the rest of the world in half just to make sure that, you know, America was placed in the middle of that. So with that kind of map in our background, it's amazing that we even know what the countries in the North American continent are. So Samantha, how does it make you feel when you're asked those kind of, but you know, where's that? And then the confusion? How do you feel when you
You
have
know,
to respond to this?
for me, it just very much brings to mind what you said, like how poor a job America does around educating people about the rest of the world and about other cultures. And I mean, of course, people wouldn't know about the cultural and ethnic history of a nation like Guyana because we don't talk enough about the slave trade and how it formed the Americas. You know, people don't know that there's a Black population in Mexico. You know, so people just don't know things, and so I don't necessarily see it as a reflection of personal ignorance. I see it as a failure of systems to educate people that there is a world outside of America and that those people's cultural experiences have value, and their expressions and identity are significant and contributory to the American experience as well. And yeah, so.
I think just to add to that, like I think about how history was taught, how I learned history in high school, and it was U.S. history, but certainly a very limited and untrue in many ways kind of U.S. history. And then there was European history, and then there was like nothing else. So like it wasn't even like
right.
It was unfair to the students, but it really speaks to how sort of Euro and white centric our education system is.
Because I really needed that AP course in ancient European history. I really needed that.
Yeah. That's right. Ancient Egypt too. We had a one unit on that.
Just in Sita, I know you had your hand up, and maybe I don't know if it comes down automatically or what happens, but please.
I was actually in the breakout session with Samantha, and we had a great discussion. But one of the things that she brought up, which really resonated with me, is accents. So like I want to share 2 points. One, kind of following up on what Nick shared. I'm an immigrant, but I came here when I was 19. So that was like in the early 80s. I just told you my age, but it was a very different world, in those days. And I'm from South India. I had a very thick accent. And that was pointed out almost on a daily basis when I was in school, and I was in school on the East Coast. And it really was, I think my accent also gave me away, and in those days, even college campuses were quite white, I mean, they're not like how UCs look today in California, definitely, But one of the things, like, it was like a combination of the accent and how I look and dressed. But I did get the question, Nick, a lot of like, where are you from? And then it's like, oh, I'm from Asia. It's like, but really, which part of Asia are you from? Two, it graduated, so to speak, to, are you from here? Because that was really connected a lot with, my accent too, like, especially once I was in grad school, as I was doing TAing and giving talks, I had to adjust my accent, not voluntarily, because I used to get like poor reviews from students that, hey, can't understand what you're saying, to like, just kind of wanting to be able to communicate, in a more effective way. So almost kind of, which is like, a little different than, what Samantha and I were talking about, is like preserving your accent, now I think people are more comfortable to preserve accent, so that definitely, I mean, even now people sometimes say like, oh, don't understand you. I'm like, what? I sound as American as apple pie, I mean, yeah, there are some, words that are different that I like, there are some words I know and I really don't know how to say them anymore, whether it's the British English or the American English, which one is the right one, like vehicle is one, I don't know which way is the right way, and I just say, okay, I give up, So, it does, like, now it's less about like, where are you from? Where are you really from? The typical immigrant question, but I tend to use more like the context of what that discussion is to give details. Like Nick said, be like, yeah, I'm from Davis, California, or I'm from California, or like depending on the context, I'm from South Asia, how much I mine into my ethnic identity and whether it's necessary. Because sometimes I feel like you don't need to know that, for us to engage kind of thing. Thanks.
Thank you. I really appreciate all of those shares. I'm sure there's many more. I hope the takeaway is that you've all learned a little bit more about each other, whether you're new to each other, you may already know each other because of the work that you do. And also that this is a great exercise to do in your organizations, in your teams, with any group. Do it with mixed families, whatever. But particularly in organizations, it's just, it's humanizing and all of the good, mostly good feelings. I mean, painful experiences can be shared also, right? Like each one of you shared things that could have been painful and could equally be on a different end. Just knowing that folks have very different experiences and you don't always have the same experience, right? Nick started that, right? It depends on how I feel, right? It depends on how many microaggressions I was confronted with today, right? We did all of it, context matters. We have to take a break, a 5-minute intermission, and we'll see you in a real 5 minutes, right?
Yeah,
Chris?
so yeah, I'll get us started. Thanks, Kavita. I just wanted to reflect a little bit from what I heard from Samantha, Sita, and Nick, and get ready for what Sarah's about to say as well. As a white person who looks clearly white, when someone asks me that, I know they mean where did I grow up, not where I'm from. So I wear that question very differently than Nick, than Samantha, or from Sita. I know you want to know, where was I born? And if it's here in Colorado, people are asking me, am I from Colorado? Because being native Colorado means something, even though native Colorado means Native American, and that's not what they mean. So I have a very different response to those questions and a very different expectation of those questions than you all have. And that's important. And I think that's going to lead into what Sarah's going to talk about after the break, understanding whiteness. And I think that's a nice way to break. So we are at 12:09. Let's make it 12:14. Go get water, go do whatever you need to do for 5 minutes. We'll see you back here at 12:14 Pacific time. Thank you so much. You're muted, Sarah.
Sorry. Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that, people. Welcome back. So we're going to talk about whiteness, and this is one of the favorite things to talk about. So whiteness is really about how power is distributed in our society, and it manifests in policy, culture, and our organizations. And the subject can be a little bit touchy, can make people feel uncomfortable. And sometimes people will say, well, do we have to talk about whiteness? But if we don't really dig into what whiteness is and understand how it's created and manifested, we will be unable to undo these power structures. We have to understand it, we have to see it. So we're gonna spend a few minutes to take a really critical look at what whiteness is and how it functions and how it affects each and every one of us. And we're gonna talk about 3 intertwined pillars of whiteness: white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility. And as Kavita's queued up, we're going to start out with a video.
It's very uncomfortable to talk about race. It's not something I do. I am feeling apprehensive because I think there's a lot of reasons why I feel like I should be able to talk about race.
I don't want to say anything
you know, that would offend anyone.
It's a very touchy subject. It's still difficult, even if you feel like you're on the right side of it, to, you know, to have a dialogue about it.
Especially for white people, because we don't want to see if the racism that we may be holding on to.
I don't know. Maybe I am racist. I certainly don't like to think that I am. And I think that's too because the perception, in this society, perception of a racist is a guy in a robe.
Now I understand that it's a system of advantages and disadvantages based on race. So as much as there's the disadvantage piece of it, there's the advantage piece of it, which is what I experience as a white person.
I want to bring up race, and I want to bring it up in a frame that helps my children think that there's no difference. But the mere fact that I might be bringing it up could suggest that there is a difference.
I remember asking a friend of my father's who's black why he was called black, because his skin was brown. And I've learned that lots of people that are white ask this question, and maybe they also received the answer that I got from my parents, which was like, oh my gosh, we're so sorry that she asked that, and it's just a term, like, move on.
One of my third grade students seemed pretty rocked after the Eric Garner case or death, and came up to me and said, you know, why, when you were little, like, were you worried about this stuff too? And I knew what he was talking about before. I mean, I didn't say, what do you mean, what stuff? I didn't want to, you know, play dumb. And I said, you know, no, like, I didn't have to be, and that's not fair. And that was really hard because he just kind of sat there, and it honestly seemed like the first time that he had considered the fact that not everyone had to think about race all the time.
I know that I'm white, and I guess I'm part of that collection. But I don't think about being white. I don't.
I really did not know that I had a racial identity. I knew I was white. I had no idea what that meant, how that had shaped my outlook on life, how that had shaped my sense of optimism, sense of belonging, sense of safety, sense of feeling entitled to go help children that I thought were a part of a community that couldn't figure out how to help themselves.
I think that impulse, that kind of colorblindness impulse, comes mostly from white people. Like, I've never heard, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure it comes from people of all kinds, but I've heard it most from white people who are saying, like, let's do this as a way of getting past this racism thing. And I think in part it comes from a sense of shame and guilt about what racism has done, and kind of how racism was built by white people.
I don't want to be ashamed of being, and plus I'm a male. It's like every group out there can be pissed off at me because I'm white and a male. And that's a weird kind of burden that some people do feel, and I certainly feel it sometimes from people that I'm privileged, I get stuff that other people don't get.
I think we're all implicated in a racist system, and I play my part in it as a white person. So I do have individual responsibility and accountability. I mean, I'm part of the system, and I do things that both perpetuate it, and I try to certainly do things that challenge it.
I realize I've never said anything. When I've heard racist jokes, when I've heard racist comments, I've never said anything. I've never spoken up and said, hey, that's racist. Not once.
In my mind, I'm not involved in any conflict that involves race. I've only been the beneficiary of it. So to talk about it is I don't think I would sound very wise.
Being white means that I have the privilege to think that I'm not affected by racism, or that I don't even have a race, because I have all these other things like a gender and a sexual orientation, and those are pretty neat. So I don't have a race, but I do, and I'm white.
Great. Kavita. Let's talk about white supremacy. So here's two sort of definitions of it. The belief that the white race is inherently superior to other races, and that white people should have control over people of other races, and the social, economic, and political systems that collectively enable white people to maintain power over people of other races. So it's both a belief and a system of power distribution. As I mentioned in the video, one of the speakers, most people think about white supremacy and associate it with the KKK, the neo-Nazis, Oath Keepers, and while those are white supremacists, white supremacy actually just also lives in our society. So it's the way that whiteness developed in our country, as Kavita was talking about earlier. It's baked into our legal systems, it's inherent in our culture. It's the part of the culture that assigns goodness and humanity to white people, while casting people and communities of color as less worthy, less human, undeserving. White supremacy culture grew into just sort of unquestioned standards of behavior, became the mainstream way of being. It's the dominant culture. It's just normalized. It's like fish in the water. You just don't see the water that you swim in. And this goes a little bit, I was thinking about this and thinking about what Nick was saying before the break. White people can experience a fundamental sense of belonging here in the United States. We generally don't get asked our racial and ethnic identity because it's just the norm. As one of the speakers in the video says, like, we don't have a race. We're just Americans. Let's go to the next slide and talk about white privilege. This is the second of our intertwined pillars of whiteness. So this is the unearned advantage based on race, which can be observed both systemically and individually. So this term white privilege can really trigger folks, so to speak, and get people feeling senses of anger, resistance, indignance. If anyone's feeling this way, that's okay. You can take a pause, try to stay with us. White privilege does not mean that your life hasn't been hard. It doesn't mean that you haven't had to overcome your own challenging situations, work 3 jobs through college, or that you haven't experienced oppression in any other number of ways. But what it does mean is that your skin tone isn't one of the things making it harder. So white privilege was an idea introduced in 1989 by a women's studies professor, Peggy McIntosh, a white woman at Wellesley College. And she wrote a paper when she sort of woke up to the fact that there was this thing called white privilege, that she was being advantaged, that she had an unearned advantage. And she listed out 26 specific examples of her privilege as a white person, so that she could help other people, other white people, sort of see this, the privileges that they're not even aware of. So there are 3 of the 26. So I'm just going to tease them out a little bit. Not to be harassed or followed when shopping. So this is sort of an individual benefit of being white. Taught that white people made civilization what it is. So I got to grow up in a educational system where I was fed false information about the superiority of whiteness, and suffer no penalty for ignorance of language and customs of people who comprise the majority of the world's population. And this is exactly what we were talking about before the break with Samantha. We center whiteness. We have no obligation to understand other people, other cultures, other countries. Another way to think about privilege, and I really like this way, it makes sense to me, is the way Debbie Irving describes it, which is tailwinds and headwinds. So I've had a tailwind pushing me along my whole life. I don't even notice it. It's just part of the privilege of being white. I don't even notice how I've been helped. So much like going for a run with the wind at your back, you don't realize that you're not actually that fast or in such good shape until you turn around and face the headwind. So white people, we don't face the headwinds of race. We don't see them. So it can feel like it can lead to this false narrative that people of color are just slower. They just can't run as fast. They're not working as hard. When in fact, people of color survive these gale force headwinds of race every day. So my tailwind directly benefits me and directly disadvantages people of color. So white people, even if we don't realize it, are actively benefiting from other people's disadvantages. So a few of my white unearned advantages, right? I think about the schools I've gone to and the jobs I've gotten, and I know that I was bumped up in front of people of color to have those opportunities because I'm white. I generally feel safe in the face of state actors in the society. I have never once been fearful of getting harassed by a police officer, let alone getting shot. And because of how white supremacy locks in white wealth, I grew up with the expectation that wealth would transfer down to me from my parents rather than me having to support them as I got older. All right, let's go to white fragility, our third intertwined pillar. So Robin DiAngelo, New York Times bestseller, highly recommended this book. She really teases out how white fragility manifests in our country. It's the state in which even a minimal amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensive moves. Layla Saad wrote a wonderful book, Me and White Supremacy, has a sort of a 30-day, I think it's a 30-day workshop. It wasn't 30-day, Kavita, I'm looking at you, but sort of unpacking white supremacy in your own life. And she says, in essence, white fragility looks like a white person taking the position of victim when it's in fact the white person who's committed acts of racial harm. So when we lay out our agreements for courageous conversations, we ask folks to stay engaged because it can be uncomfortable to talk about race, particularly in cross-racial groups, and white people in particular are unused to talking about race. In my generation, I was taught that talking about race was rude and even racist. So it can be really easy to retreat from feelings of shame and discomfort. That one speaker in the video talked about the feelings of shame that inevitably arise when discussing race. And these discussions can sort of engender fight or flight responses. You find we may go silent or try to undermine the work. And as a white person, it's really important to build our own racial stamina, to do our own personal work, and understand that we have honored advantage, and to develop the ability to really listen to other people. Also know, hey, that you aren't helpless. You can use your advantage to weaken systems of power. Peggy McIntosh calls it a bank account. You didn't ask for it, but you can choose to spend it. And white people have a lot of privilege and more power than they may realize, right? We have connections to time, voice, spaces, connections. We can clear the path to undo our unearned advantage. And finally, it's really important to note that while none of us chose our race or the term white, and none of us created the society that we were all born into, we white people need to own and take responsibility for the advantages that come with whiteness because they're coming at the expense of someone else. Isabel Wilkerson said in her really awesome book, Cast, I highly recommend it, that we inherited this house. It has deep structural flaws that we would not have chosen. But if we're going to live in the house, we have to fix the house. So as we engage in our next discussion, I would really just encourage the white people in the room to not get sidelined by feelings of shame. Stay in the conversation, try to find a way through those feelings to acceptance and action. And I think we're going to small group breakouts. And the question is,
we're not going into small groups, we're staying in the large group.
We're going to stay in a large group, not small group. So our question in our large group is, what examples of privilege have you experienced in your life or observed around you? And maybe we should put that in the chat, and we can go, if we can go on camera, that would be great.
And Sarah, there's already a reflection from Jessica.
Right. So, so this is about, Jessica's talking about her discomfort in talking about race. I don't know, Jessica, if you want to come into the room and share your reflection.
Sure. So I think the frustrating thing for me is that, you know, I never mean any harm in the questions that I ask or the things that I say. And sometimes I wonder if I was a different race, if it would be taken differently, you know, my seeking to understand something, if it would be taken a different way, if I was a different color. I mean, literally, I was talking with some colleagues in here in my office during the break, and I'm like, okay, I need to learn about my whiteness. And, you know, I had someone from Honduras, I had someone who was Black, and somebody who is Polynesian, you know, and one of the people that works really closely to me just looked at me and said, Jessica, I'm going to take the shovel and we're going to walk out. Because you end up as a white person digging yourself into this hole of not being able to communicate what you're thinking or what you're thinking, and not wanting to be offensive. I mean, I'm digging it now. I don't know. There's no way we can learn how to address these issues being white without being offensive.
Jessica, thank you so much for sharing. These are really tough issues. And it's certainly true that our skin, lighter skin, carries all kinds of meaning that we don't want it to carry, right? And it's going to get interpreted, the things that come out of our mouths is going to get interpreted in ways that wasn't our intention. And so two things, and we're going to talk about this in our next section too, is to know that we're going to make mistakes. It is going to happen. We will say things that will offend, and that's going to happen. And that to recognize that your intention is going to be different than your impact. So if you make a mistake and someone gets hurt, hear it, listen to it, and just do better next time. Our job isn't to be perfect, right? Our job is to be better, right? And you just have to sort of flip your mindset and open yourself up to getting feedback. So when folks share with you, let yourself hear it.
I'm really lucky because the people that I'm friends with at work that I do have these conversations with just kind of shake their hand and go, Jessica, okay, you've said it to me, it's okay. I know you mean it one way, but don't ever ask anybody else that question, you know, and it's learning what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask. And it's really sad because, you know, I'm in my 50s and I'm still learning.
Yeah, it's lifelong learning, honestly. It doesn't end. We spent a lifetime learning how to thrive in white supremacy and how to benefit from it. It's going to take more than a session, more than a year to unlearn it. It's a process.
I think we have Jen. Jen had her hat up, and then Jillian.
Just to answer the question that was asked, when I was younger, I think I was really unaware of my privilege. And then when I was a teenager, I moved into the inner city in San Francisco, and seeing the difference in schools was just huge. And that's where I saw my privilege in inner city neighborhoods. The schools, there is not enough books. The desks were all broken. The classrooms were way oversized. And that's when that was the journey for me, is starting to see all the privilege that I had growing up, the head start, I think, that I got in life just for being white.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. It's in every aspect, right? But to have that sort of awakening and see it so viscerally. I think Jillian.
Hi, yes. I don't have a camera on this computer today, so I'm just going to use my microphone, and I want to share just experiences that my mom shared with me growing up. She was born in the 40s, grew up in the 50s, 60s, and we are Hispanic. Although we don't appear like a traditional Hispanic, we don't have the dark skin, we have the light fair skin. And she said when she was growing up and she went to an equestrian center with some of her friends, that there was a young Black lady riding her horse, but she was forced to exit the facility because my mom and her friends were a group of supposedly white girls that wanted to ride. And so growing up, my mom would tell us, being a Hispanic, you're always going to have to try harder. And sorry, I'm getting emotional. But so that's just been something I've learned my whole life, you know, hiding from the sun, trying to fade my skin so that I would appear to be a different race, identify as somebody that I really wasn't. And now that I'm older and I married a white man, and he's had experiences with the law. And during this recent Black Lives Matter movement, he said, I don't understand why they feel like they're more oppressed than me. And he talked about the struggles, like what you mentioned today, the struggles that he went through and his family went through. But an example that he went through was that his father used to deal marijuana, and they shipped it across state lines, and they were caught, but all they did was pay a fine. And I said to him, I was like, if you were not white, if you were any other color, do you think that's all you would get? You know, and I talked to him about examples of men and women that have had as little as a joint on them that were African American, and they're serving 10, 15 years in prison. And so helping him realize what his privilege has given him, like you said, the tailwinds versus the front winds, and it's like recognizing those things in our lives to help us make better choices.
Thank you, Jillian, for sharing that. And boy, like you just teased out like so many ways that white privilege helps white people and hurts people of color. And bravo to you for helping other white people see and learn, because that's the only way we're going to make change. That's the only way we're going to make change. That's an important way to make change. Darnisha has her hand up. I want to make sure you get in.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I had to leave, but I'm back. I want to look at privilege kind of from a different lens. So my parents were all from the South. My parents grew up picking cotton. Dad migrated us to Ohio when I was 2 years old. He ended up owning his own trucking business and became a dignitary for 22 years until he passed away. He told me the reason he moved us, and he passed away 4 years ago, to Ohio was he couldn't see himself providing a life for his family there in the South. And because of that, my parents were laser focused on getting higher education for themselves and to give me opportunities that I would never been able to be exposed to in the South. And part of that was attending a Catholic school. And so I get this education, integrated the school, fought literally sometimes physically for my right to be there. And then, you know, by the grace of God, I was propelled into corporate America, and then worked for 8 years of San Diego in the police department and things. And then I worked for the regional task force on homelessness. But when I was in school, because we had a big house and I attended a predominantly white school, the Black kids in the mixed neighborhood that I grew up with felt that I was privileged. They didn't want to play with me, right? They used to call me the little rich girl. We weren't rich, but we just lived middle class America. You know, we didn't have any lack in our home. And then when I would go to the South for the summer to visit, I spoke too proper. And then when I was in school and I wanted to be part of plays that depicted the South, you're not Black enough, right? So this life that my parents exposed me to, so I would have a better life, seemed privileged to some, and then in the space of that life, I still wasn't good enough or Black enough. So I just wanted to kind of flip the lens on that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. I mean, one of the ways that white supremacy shows up in our society is by splitting and not letting us be our full selves. So you're not allowed to be your full self because you're not fitting some categorization that other people want to put on you, right? And you get sidelined, belittled, not made to feel bad. And that is a thing that white supremacy benefits from, that splitting people up, not letting there be solidarity. And I know I want to keep this conversation going, but I think we're running out of time, right? And we have one more, I'm looking at Kavita, we have one more section to get through, and I need to pull up my notes. Hang on if I can find them. And let me see, hang on. All right, so we're going to talk about detour spotting. Super quick, I'm going to try to get through this quickly. So because we don't normally have cross-racial discussions, and because these discussions cause racial stress in white people, we often witness what we call detours or distancing behaviors, so that white people can avoid this internal conflict. So we're going to talk about a few of these, and you'll see these show up anytime you're in a cross-racial dialogue or you see white people talking about race, you will see these show up. So, and there's a whole bunch of them, but here's a few. So color blindness, you'll hear people say, well, I don't see color. We're all just people. Of course, we're all people, but everyone sees color. And when you say, I don't see color, you're erasing the lived experience of people of color. So it's a way to it's a way to not talk about race. Innocence by association. Well, I'm not racist because I have a Black friend, I have a Black spouse, good coworkers, etc. So having good relationships with people of color is great, but that in and of itself, it doesn't end systemic racism, nor does it take away your own unearned advantage. Reverse racism. You'll hear people say, well, people of color can be just as racist as white people. And the distinction is that individuals can have prejudice, but that's different than systemic racism. Individual prejudice does not come attached to systems of power. Being hurt and being oppressed are not the same. Yes, but what about me? I grew up poor, I'm female, I'm a religious minority. So acknowledging and working against systemic racism does not eliminate your lived experiences. It just means that your skin tone wasn't a hurdle for you. That's all it means. And then silence. And we talked about this a little bit before. White people will often weigh every word, remain guarded, not talk at all, retreat, use only really abstract or what they think is politically correct language. And this fear of being called racist or offending people of color really inhibits our authentic engagement in the conversation and the work. And if we want to do the work and we all want to create a better world, we've got to stay in the conversation. Let's go to the next slide. And Dolly Chugg, I love her book, Person You Mean to Be, really great advice. And we talked about this a little bit in our conversation. We need grace to let in the idea that we may not be as perfect as we thought we were. Grace means everyone's at a different point in this journey. Grace means that we all make mistakes. I'm going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. It's more important to take a risk and talk about racism and know that you might screw up than to not talk about it at all. And the other thing she talks about, which I love, is she talks about a growth mindset. So really helpful to have a growth mindset in these discussions. Don't assume perfection, assume growth. Assume you're going to stumble up. Ask, how can I learn from my mistakes? And one more note on the consequences of mistakes, because this came up and it comes up. I experienced it, it's just true. So listen, when we step on people's toes, this happens all the time, we hurt them unintentionally, right? And in those instances, we just don't hesitate to apologize. When we make a mistake and a person of color expresses pain and hurt to us, it's just helpful to accept that our impact may be different from our intent and figure out a way to get over our feelings of shame and embarrassment and just apologize and listen and learn. And that's going to be our path to healing and to have better dialogue. And I think that's it for my section. And we are not too far off time. We're going to have a large group discussion. What is your own experience? Actually, let's put them.
Oh, sorry, I took it off the
I know, I couldn't read it.
Yeah. So this is the point, because we have about 10, 12 minutes. One, thank you all for all your shares. It's always challenging for us to kind of run through the presentation and give any kind of, there's never enough good, respectful space, especially when you share such personal stories. So know that we appreciate all of your shares, the not even nuances, but real differences, and what a Latino Latina woman experiences, what Darnisha, the shift in privilege, socioeconomic identities, right? We are intersectional all the time, right? Very few of us carries any one identity. We have our gender, we have our socioeconomic status, we have our whatever the race is or a national origin, all of that. We have ways that we speak with accents or not, and all of that we have to carry. So thank you. I hope you do see value in, and you have to create space around your teams if you are going to be able to enter in conversations around this, because there's so much. It's amazing. People are often taken back to being a young child, right? Jen, you talked about, well, just what you saw when you entered. I don't know if it was middle school you were going into when you got into San Francisco, but just the stark disparities. But when it comes to exclusion, we're often taken back to very, very young experiences as a child, which is so painful to hear. And it often happens in our own family. You know, the colorism that Jillian was sharing is across brown cultures, very much across every brown culture. That within our own families, people telling you that your skin is just not light enough, and placing value or devaluing. So now just opening it up, we would love to, the detours, I feel like helps us get a bit at so much of the challenge around talking about whiteness and our different privileges, whatever they are. So it'd be great if people want to share any experiences you have with detours. Maybe you have suggestions of how you respond to them. And then anything else you might want to talk about. Feel free to just open it up, any questions you have or experiences you want to share. We'd love to hear from you.
Kavita, I put something in the chat I just want to kind of talk about for a second. I've seen those New York Times videos several times. And this time through, I was looking at them in a different lens. And I was struck by the fact that the white folks in the last video were very unsure of what to say from second to second. You could see it in the cadence. That's not the way they would normally talk. And when I was thinking about the Latinx folks and the Black women, they were very clear about what they were saying. They've had these conversations around race over and over and over again, and the white folks haven't. So I was just so struck by that this time through that I hadn't noticed it the first couple times I watched it. But it is one of those things that you can see the uncomfortability in the cadence of language. Even. And I think that was very striking. But when we talk about detours, I grew up white in a white community. And my family, when we talk about race and privilege, they see privilege as socioeconomical. They're still poor. So they think that's their detour. Well, we're still poor. So we're not oppressing anybody. We're still the oppressed. But I try to turn it back on my parents and say, well, what if you were as you are, but of a different color as well? And then they start to get it. But it is hard for at least my parents' generation to really think in that manner. And you have to really break down a lot of walls. And it can be very hard to get around those detours. And that's a detour I've seen time and time again. So I just wanted to share that. Before Jen, I see you have your hand.
I don't know if this is so much a detour, but I have this memory, when my husband and I, we travel, we like to go to the local, support local industry in the community. And I was traveling with my family to Bahamas, and we saw this slave museum, and I brought my kids into it. My kids were young at the time, and it was profound. Like it was huge. And for me too, like I thought that I knew history, and there are a lot of things I had no idea. And my sister at that time, she wouldn't take her kids in, and she told me, like, why would you do that? That's just so scary for them. And I didn't understand why she would think it was so scary. I mean, it's history, and it is dark, but it's real. And my kids are now adults, and they still to this day talk about that museum.
Jen, that's such, I have kids too. They're middle school and high school now, but only 4 years ago, it was the elementary school conversations around, and a lot, just as much with parents who identify as people of color, having the same real different opinions on when you have conversations around police encounters, when you have definitely the slavery discussion, like when do I introduce this to my child? And people have a real, just lots of different opinions, even people of color, right? Like everyone's not ready to do that, especially if you've been able to protect your child from all of the ills of our society and racism in particular. Often people want to just keep protecting that, that youth, that untouched mind of unharmed, let's say. And yet there's so many different, well, I just know even among all my friends who identify as people of color, they've all done it different ways. For different, it depends on what your partner, if you have a partner, what your partner wants to do, right? It's
the questions that opened up about it. So that's what I thought was really great, because it just opened up a lot of conversation with me and my kids over the years.
Yeah, and you have a great example that now we can all take to people, say it's painful because it is, and it was, and someone experienced this, right? And we did this, and now they're better for it because, to your point, they'll now question so much more. Hey, Samantha.
Hi, I was thinking about the detour conversation. I remember when I was in grad school at USD, a very predominantly white institution, and taking a human relations course, and when issues of race, bubbled up to the surface, that notion of watching the white students get silent, or being in other classes and watching the white students not engage in the conversation. And then you have to have discourse about labor and making the people of color do the labor for moving these formative conversations along. And so, I would have classmates, friends, colleagues who are maybe Latina, Black, whatever. And some of us had different perspectives, like, I'm not doing the labor for this conversation today. I'm going to sit silently and allow white people to take responsibility for actually engaging the subject matter and being reflective and being uncomfortable. I mean, so much so that there ended up being a student protest one semester, and students of color, and this was during COVID, refused to go on screen to participate in classes. And when you're virtual, that's a really significant statement. And watching classes be so silent because white students were very minimally engaged, and systems have to hold white people accountable for being uncomfortable for the sake of growth and education. And people of color who have been socially conditioned to make white people comfortable in all kinds of settings and circumstances have to be willing to sometimes step back and be silent, or sometimes say something that's going to make people uncomfortable, and figuring out how to navigate those lanes at different times and under different conditions may be reflective of your personal experience, your upbringing, or like you said, how many microaggressions did I encounter today? And just, do I have the energy or motivation to engage this? So yeah, the detour thing is very real. The notion of white lady tears and all of that kind of stuff, and the fragility, and I really appreciated the definition of superiority, white superiority, having the two distinct definitions, because people never get that second one. They like they say, they make the association with the Klan and the overt hatred, but they don't understand that white superiority comes from maybe your unconscious belief or ideology around just inherent betterness attributed to your identity, and that systems support that inherent betterness. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Wow. I mean, well, I appreciate that you appreciated the presentation. The thing I was thinking about, Sarah, was that resource, Tema Akun, because this notion of being uncomfortable and being blamed, right? Because that's the thing. Nobody wants to, well, there's many things. So let me say that's not the thing, many things, but like, nobody wants to be blamed. And that is a very big detour, right? You're not going to blame me for what happened 400 years ago, even though it wasn't just 400 years ago. We're talking about 50 years ago. We're talking about things that happened 5 years ago. We're talking about things that happened last week, right? We are not just talking about but none of this is about blame. It's about acknowledging and learning and sharing these real things that have happened to people in current day, in my generation, not, hundreds of years ago. So there's that debunking. And then LaQuasha, I really want to, first of all, appreciate that you shared this, what is very typically shared, often shared. There is this writer that Sarah and I love, Tema Akun. And if you could chat that name in there, Sarah, that'd be great. She is a white woman who writes really deeply, and she's got this amazing website. She's written for years. So if anybody can read it, but she writes deeply around these very complicated feelings that white folks and white-facing folks and some people of color may carry, depending on what your lens is. She writes really deeply about a lot of these detours, and particularly the expectation of comfort and not wanting to, just like the slightest bit of fragility and all of that. But I just highly recommend looking into her stuff. It helps. It's deep and it's important. And she also has all this poetry and art weaved into everything she writes. So it's better than a bunch of slides. It's beautiful. And there's just like a deeper reflection there because of the artistic spin on it. Chris, I'm going to give you the final, the final words here.
Thank you, Kavita. Thank you, Sarah, for the presentation today. And thank you for joining us today. This was not an easy conversation. As I said, I've been through this type of conversations many, many times, and it's always very different. And I thought today was great. I want to thank all of you that did share. All of you didn't feel comfortable to share. Hopefully next time you will. And just really just grateful for the community we had today. I feel a lot of things right now that are very positive. But I need to do the formal stuff. So thank you for attending the California Housing Community Development Workshop session offered through the Emergency Solution Grant, Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. Look out for more information on our racial equity series. We have plenty of trainings coming up. A quick 3-question survey is going to pop up when you exit this session. Please do give us feedback. We read it every Wednesday. I'm not joking. We read it, we adapt, we learn, and we target things based on your suggestions. So please do that. And thank you so much. Take some time today, some space and time to decompress from such stressful conversations. And we will hopefully see you all next week at our next racial equity training. Be well.
Bye, folks.